and at least 10 states have passed laws addressing the expungement or erasure of certain marijuana convictions. Joining me to talk about the legalization trend here in the U.S. is Sanho Tree. He's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and director of its Drug Policy Project. And Sanho, I guess my first question is there a distinction between what we're seeing between marijuana and sort of what would be classified as hard drugs?
Yeah, there's always, it's very arbitrary how we classify what is a drug, and it's very culturally specific. So in the United States, alcohol and tobacco kill far, 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 far more people than marijuana ever has or ever will. And yet we don't think of those things as drugs. So yes, I think marijuana should be considered, should be taken out of that category of so-called hard drugs.
For the states that have legalized marijuana, has it turned into a cash cow for those states, and if so, how?
It certainly provided a lot of tax revenue, so it's being used in research and health, in education funding, so all kinds of other things so they're able to tax this stuff, rather than in the past they've tried to suppress it underground, and you can't regulate or control, much less tax something you deliberately drive underground.
I believe here in D.C. they wanted to use those taxes for law enforcement.
Yes, D.C. voters overwhelmingly passed a marijuana legalization referendum in 2014 by something like 70%. It's overwhelming in the city. But the Republicans in Congress intervened at the last minute to try to quash that. So they've outlawed the ability for the D.C. government to have taxed sales and regulation of cannabis, but it's legal to possess and to grow and to give it away here.
There are still states that criminalize marijuana use, all use, even medical. What is, to play devil's advocate if you will, what is their reasoning? It's
basically old stigma. A lot of it is left over from the old reefer madness days, that if a lot of debunked theories, like the gateway theory, where the cops say, you know, kids, if you smoke a joint, you'll be shooting heroin in 6 months. And that has a very perverse backward effect, right? So kids think, well, what other lies are the grown-ups telling me? And they forget the really important lessons about far more dangerous substances. So yeah, so legalization is something that's spreading very quickly in this country.
You know, I'm old enough to remember the Just Say No to Drugs campaign, which many people say failed to sort of address the issues of demand. Why are you seeing efforts to sort of address the policy to refocus how drug addiction and drug use is seen in this country?
It's happening slowly, and it's happening in part due to the opioid and the overdose epidemic in this country, and that it's hitting a lot of more white people, so that people are beginning to become more compassionate about this. Whereas in the past, the drug war has been a very racist tool of law enforcement. So I think the nature of this problem is changing slowly. But what we need to remember on World Drug Day is that we need to focus on why people consume drugs at such high levels in this country compared to other advanced industrialized countries. And I think we need to look at the drivers of poverty, despair, and alienation. The last two cut across class lines. And the other thing we need to look at is why people traffic and produce these drugs. And that is an economic problem rooted in the politics of drug prohibition, where we turn things that are minimally processed agricultural and chemical commodities that ought to cost pennies per dose, things like methamphetamines, heroin, cocaine, and instead we transform these vegetable matter into things that are priceless, for which people are willing to kill and die and to do anything to traffic.
How do you think the trend in the U.S. to legalize marijuana is different or similar to what we're seeing in other countries?
I think there's a global trend to move away from the so-called war on drugs. We've had it for so long now, and if you look at the price, the purity, and availability of drugs, those are near record levels of failure, and it shows that prohibition hasn't worked. That it has enriched criminal organizations in an economy that really has no inherent value. It's the risk premium of the war on drugs that makes these drugs so valuable. That's what keeps this thing in motion globally. Otherwise, they're dealing with something that's worth as much as, you know, aspirin or something simple to produce.
Sanho Tree, thank you so much for your insight.